The whisper came first, soft as snowfall, close as breath against skin. Thomas Whitmore pressed his back against the frozen pine, every muscle locked in primal terror as the voice circled him in the darkness. It spoke his daughter's name, Sarah. The word formed perfectly in the winter air, carried on breath that shouldn't exist, and Thomas felt his sanity crack like ice beneath his boots. 3 days lost in the Superior National Forest, and now this. Something that knew the name he'd been screaming into the void since the storm separated them. The voice came again, closer, and with it a smell like ancient meat and pine needles, like hunger itself had learned to walk. Thomas turned, raising his flashlight with shaking hands, and in that beam of wavering light, he saw it. Towering, skeletal, antlers branching from a skull that had once been human, skin stretched grey and translucent over bones that jutted at impossible angles. But it was the eyes that shattered him. Blue eyes, human eyes, pleading eyes that somehow held recognition, held memory, held something that whispered of what this thing had been before the hunger took everything else. The creature opened its mouth, rows of yellowed teeth behind lips that barely moved, and when it spoke again in that terrible, gentle whisper, Thomas understood. This thing hunting him through the Minnesota winter wasn't just a monster. It was his hunting partner. It was David Chen, and it had been calling to him for help. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. The transformation had begun 47 days before Thomas would hear his name whispered in the dark. David Chen, 34 years old, geologist and weekend hunter, had felt the first stirrings of something wrong during the October expedition that should have been routine. The Superior National Forest stretched across northeastern Minnesota in endless waves of pine and birch, a wilderness so vast that a person could walk for weeks and never see another human soul. David had loved that isolation once. Now, standing at the edge of everything he'd been, he remembered that love like a man remembers a dream upon waking, distant, fading, replaced by something far more terrible and far more real. The hunger had started small, a gnawing emptiness that venison and trail mix couldn't satisfy, growing each day until David understood with crystal clarity that what lived inside him now wasn't human appetite. It was older than Minnesota, older than the forests themselves, a curse that indigenous Ojibwe elders had whispered about around fires long before white men came to name this land. The Wendigo, Windigo, Witiko, the spirit of insatiable hunger, of winter that never ends, of humans who consume until consumption is all that remains. David had studied the legends during his geological surveys, treating them as folklore, cultural mythology to be respected, but not feared. The Ojibwe guides he'd worked with over the years spoke of the Wendigo with a particular kind of dread. Not the theatrical fear of campfire stories, but the quiet, bone-deep terror of people who knew that some hungers could never be fed, some transformations could never be reversed. They said the Wendigo was created when a person resorted to cannibalism during times of famine, when the act of consuming human flesh opened a door inside the soul that could never be closed again. The spirit would enter through that door, transforming the person into something monstrous, growing taller with each victim consumed, antlers sprouting from the skull, skin turning grey and translucent, eternal hunger replacing every other desire. David had nodded politely during those conversations, filed them away as anthropological data, never imagining that he would one day feel antlers breaking through his own skull like trees growing from cursed soil. The October expedition had gone wrong in ways that seemed mundane at first. David's research team, himself, 2 graduate students named Marcus Rivera and Aaliyah Washington, and their equipment specialist, a weathered woman of 56 named Ruth Kowalski, had ventured deep into the Boundary Waters region to collect mineral samples. The weather turned faster than predicted, an early blizzard that trapped them miles from their vehicles with rapidly dwindling supplies. Marcus, 23 and prone to anxiety, had wanted to attempt the hike back immediately. Aaliyah, 25 and pragmatic, had argued for waiting out the storm in their camp. Ruth, who'd survived 3 decades of Minnesota winters, had suggested rationing what they had and sending up distress flares. David, as team leader, had made the decision that would damn him. They would wait 2 more days, conserve energy, let the storm pass before attempting the trek. He'd been so certain it was the right call. By day 3, Marcus was delirious with hypothermia and hunger. By day 4, his heart had simply stopped beating in his sleep, the cold claiming him with the quiet efficiency of a predator that didn't need to announce itself. They'd buried him as best they could in the frozen ground, Ruth reciting prayers while Aliyah sobbed into her hands. David had stood apart, feeling something shift inside his chest, some fundamental reordering of his relationship with the world. The hunger that night had been different from anything he'd experienced before. Not the simple need for calories, but a yawning emptiness that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than his stomach, somewhere in the architecture of his soul itself. He didn't remember making the decision. That was what haunted him most in the days that followed, as his body began its terrible transformation. He didn't remember the moment when survival instinct overrode morality, when hunger became permission, when Marcus's frozen body stopped being a person they'd failed to save and became something else entirely. David only remembered waking in the pre-dawn darkness, with blood on his hands and the taste of copper in his mouth, Ruth screaming, Aliyah backing away with her knife raised, and the knowledge, certain and irreversible, that he had crossed a line that existed for reasons far older than human law. The Wendigo spirit had been waiting for exactly that moment. It entered him like winter entering a house through a cracked window, seeping into every corner, displacing warmth with cold, replacing David Chen, the geologist, with something that wore his memories like a coat it was rapidly outgrowing. The physical changes began within hours. His fingers lengthened, joints cracking and reforming with sounds like branches breaking under snow. His spine curved and stretched, adding inches to his height that his skin struggled to accommodate. When he looked at his reflection in the ice of a frozen stream, he saw his face already changing, cheekbones sharpening to knife edges, eyes sinking deeper into the skull, lips pulling back from teeth that seemed to be multiplying in rows. Ruth and Aliyah had run. David couldn't blame them. He'd tried to tell them to run, had formed the words with a mouth that was already forgetting how to make human sounds. They'd fled into the snow, and some vestige of David's humanity had been grateful for their escape, had hoped they would make it to safety, would tell the authorities what had happened, would warn others. But the Wendigo didn't want them to escape. The Wendigo wanted to feed, and the hunger was so vast now, so all-consuming, that David's consciousness was being drowned in it, like a voice drowned in a storm. He'd hunted them through the forest for 2 days and 2 nights. The Wendigo moved through the snow without effort, its elongated legs covering ground that would have exhausted a human, its senses attuned to the scent of fear and the sound of heartbeats echoing through the winter silence. David had screamed inside his own skull, begging his body to stop, to let them go, but the hunger paid no attention to the dying echoes of the man he'd been. It found Ruth first, cornered against a cliff face where she'd tried to climb to higher ground. She'd fought with a camping axe, landing one solid blow against David's shoulder that would have crippled a normal man. The Wendigo had barely noticed. When it was done, when the hunger had fed, David's consciousness surfaced just long enough to see what remained of the woman who'd taught him how to read topographical maps, who'd shown him where to find the best wild blueberries in August, who'd treated him like the son she'd never had. The transformation accelerated after that feeding. Antlers began to push through David's skull, small at first, then branching into complex structures that resembled the bare trees surrounding him. His skin lost all pigmentation, becoming translucent enough that the bones beneath were visible, creating patterns like frost on glass. His height increased another foot, then 2, his body becoming a skeletal tower of unnatural proportions. The Wendigo was taking full possession now, pushing David's humanity into smaller and smaller corners of their shared consciousness, and David found himself able to resist less and less with each passing hour. Aliyah had made it farther than Ruth, her youth and panic driving her through the snow with desperate speed. But the forest was vast, and the Wendigo was patient. It tracked her for another day, staying just out of sight, herding her away from any path that might lead to rescue. David watched from inside his own eyes as the creature he'd become played with its prey, understanding with sick horror that the Wendigo didn't just hunger for flesh, it hungered for fear, for desperation, for the moment when hope finally died and its victims understood they would never see another sunrise. When it finally took Alia, she'd been too exhausted to run anymore, too cold to even scream. She'd looked up at the monster looming over her, and David had seen recognition in her eyes. She'd known it was him. She'd whispered his name like a question, like a plea, and David had tried with every fragment of will he still possessed to stop what happened next. He'd failed. After Alia, something shifted. The Wendigo had fed well, had taken the lives necessary to complete its transformation, and in the terrible satiation that followed, David found a small measure of control returning. Not enough to reclaim his body, not enough to reverse what he'd become, but enough to think, to plan, to remember why he needed to resist. The hunger was still there, would always be there now, eternal and insatiable, but David discovered he could sometimes direct it, could sometimes choose to hunt animals instead of humans, could sometimes force the creature to move away from populated areas rather than toward them. It was a constant battle, exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, but it was the only form of redemption available to him now. He'd retreated deeper into the Superior National Forest, far from hiking trails and campsites, trying to keep the monster isolated from potential victims. For weeks he existed in this liminal state, neither fully David nor fully Wendigo, wrestling for control of a body that was becoming increasingly alien. The creature was taller now than any human had a right to be, nearly 9 feet of skeletal horror that could tear through trees like they were paper. Its senses were preternaturally sharp. He could hear heartbeats from miles away, could smell fear on the wind, could track prey through the densest forest with an efficiency that made wolves seem clumsy by comparison. And always, the hunger gnawed at him, a void that no amount of deer or bear could fill, whispering that only human flesh would truly satisfy, that only by feeding properly could the pain stop. David learned to identify the whispers as the Wendigo spirit itself, separate from his own thoughts, a malevolent intelligence that had made its home in his body and had no intention of leaving. It spoke to him in dreams, in moments of weakness, promising relief from the constant agony of transformation if he would only stop fighting, only accept what he'd become, only feed properly and let the hunger guide him. Sometimes David was tempted. The pain of resisting was immense, a psychic weight that crushed him a little more each day. But then he would remember Marcus's face, Ruth's kindness, Alia's terrified recognition, and he would find the strength to hold on for another hour, another day, another week. The isolation became its own kind of torture. David had been a social person before, someone who thrived on collaboration and conversation. Now he avoided all human contact, knowing that his presence put people in mortal danger. He watched from the shadows as park rangers searched for the missing research team, saw the grief on the faces of Marcus's parents when they came to lay flowers at the last known campsite, heard Alia's sister being interviewed on a news broadcast about the mysterious disappearances in the Superior National Forest. Each sighting was a knife in what remained of his heart, a reminder of the lives he'd destroyed and the monster he'd become. But David had underestimated how thoroughly the Wendigo would claim him, had believed that if he just stayed isolated enough, fought hard enough, he could maintain this fragile equilibrium indefinitely. He'd been wrong. The spirit grew stronger with each passing week, fed not just by consumed flesh but by the winter itself, by the cold and the darkness and the desperate isolation. It began to assert control more frequently, taking over David's body for longer periods, hunting with a cunning that suggested it had done this many times before across many hosts. David would come back to awareness miles from where he'd last been conscious, surrounded by the remains of animals torn apart with a savagery that suggested the Wendigo had been experimenting, practicing, preparing for when it would hunt humans again. The first time it forced him to approach civilization, David knew he was losing the battle. The creature had walked him to the edge of a small town called Ely, population 3,000, standing just beyond the tree line where it could watch people going about their evening routines. David had screamed inside their shared skull, had fought with everything he had left, had managed to turn the creature away at the last possible moment. But the Wendigo had laughed, an internal sound like winter wind through dead trees, and David had understood that it had never intended to attack. It had simply been showing him that it could, that his control was slipping, that eventually it would do whatever it wanted and David's resistance would mean nothing. That was when Thomas Whitmore had entered the forest. Thomas, 42 years old, insurance adjuster and devoted father, had brought his daughter Sarah on what was supposed to be a bonding trip, 3 days of hunting and camping before the deep winter set in. David had sensed them the moment they'd entered his territory, had felt the Wendigo stir with interest, had known with sick certainty what would happen if he couldn't maintain control. He'd tried to drive them away with signs, knocked over their first campsite, scattered their supplies, left claw marks on trees that any sensible person would recognize as a warning to leave. But Thomas was stubborn, determined to give his daughter the experience he'd promised her, and they'd pushed deeper instead of turning back. The storm had caught them on the second day, the same kind of early blizzard that had doomed David's research team. David had watched from a distance as Thomas set up emergency shelter, as 14-year-old Sarah helped gather firewood with the eager competence of a girl trying to prove herself capable. The Wendigo had circled them all night, and David had battled it with everything he had, forcing it away from the camp again and again, screaming at Thomas and Sarah in his mind to wake up, to run, to understand the danger. But they'd slept peacefully, trusting in their tent and their fire, having no idea that something monstrous prowled just beyond the light. By the third day, they were lost. The storm had disoriented them, covered their tracks, turned the familiar forest into an alien landscape of white and shadow. David heard Thomas calling Sarah's name, heard the growing panic in his voice as he realized they'd become separated in the snow. He heard Sarah crying somewhere to the east, her young voice thin and afraid, and he felt the Wendigo respond to that fear like a shark responding to blood in water, felt it surge forward with hunger that David could no longer fully contain. The creature had found Sarah first, cornered against a fallen log where she'd taken shelter from the wind. David had managed to stop it from attacking, had wrestled back just enough control to make the Wendigo circle instead of strike, to watch instead of feed. Sarah had seen it, had looked up through the snow and locked eyes with the monster, and David had seen his own reflection in her terrified gaze, but she hadn't run. She'd been too scared to move, frozen by the same primal terror that had paralyzed prey animals since the dawn of time. The Wendigo had been pleased by this, had savored her fear, had been preparing to feed when David had done something he hadn't known he was still capable of. He'd forced the creature to speak. The voice that came from the Wendigo's mouth was barely human, a whisper that sounded like wind through a crypt, like the last breath of a dying man, but it had formed words, had said Sarah's name with something almost like gentleness. The girl had fainted, and the Wendigo had stood over her unconscious form while David and the spirit battled for what would happen next. "Feed," the Wendigo had demanded. "She's young, tender, perfect. Feed and grow stronger." "No," David had screamed back. "Not her, not a child. Anyone but a child." The battle had raged inside their shared skull for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And finally, miraculously, David had won. The Wendigo had retreated from Sarah, had disappeared back into the forest, leaving the girl alive. But the spirit's hunger was volcanic now, enraged by the denial, demanding satisfaction. It had turned that hunger toward finding Thomas, toward taking the father since David had protected the daughter. David had tried to fight it, had tried to turn the creature toward animals, toward anything that wasn't human, but the Wendigo was done being controlled. It wanted human prey, and it would have human prey. And David's resistance only seemed to make it more determined, more cruel in its approach. It had tracked Thomas through the forest with patient malevolence, staying just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had come when Thomas, desperate and hypothermic, had found temporary shelter against the frozen pine. The Wendigo had circled him in the darkness, had spoken his daughter's name in that terrible whisper, had revealed itself in the beam of his flashlight. And David, watching through the creature's eyes, had seen recognition dawn on Thomas's face. They'd met before, brief encounters at the ranger station, casual conversation about trails and weather. Thomas knew who David Chen had been, and now Thomas was seeing what David Chen had become, and the horror in his expression was worse than any physical pain the transformation had inflicted. The Wendigo had opened its mouth to feed when something unexpected happened. Thomas didn't run. He stared into those two human eyes and he spoke, his voice steady despite his fear. "David," he said. "David Chen. I know you're in there. Fight it." Those words, that recognition, that appeal to whatever humanity might remain, they gave David the leverage he needed. The Wendigo recoiled, furious at being named, at being recognized as something that had once been human. In that moment of distraction, David seized control with force he hadn't known he still possessed. The creature's body went rigid, locked in place by an internal battle that was no longer one-sided. Thomas had stared at the frozen monster for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, and then he'd run. Not away from the forest, but toward where he'd last seen his daughter, driven by paternal instinct that overrode self-preservation. The Wendigo had howled, a sound that shattered the winter silence and sent every animal in the forest fleeing in terror, and had given chase. David had fought it every step, had made it stumble, had forced it to slow, had screamed warnings ahead that came out as inhuman shrieks, but might, he hoped, be enough to alert Thomas to its approach. They'd crashed through the forest in a deadly race, the Wendigo hunting, David sabotaging, Thomas running for his daughter's life. Sarah had woken to her father's shouts, had emerged from her shelter just as Thomas reached her. He'd grabbed her hand and they'd run together, Thomas dragging her through snow that seemed to clutch at their ankles like hands. The Wendigo had been right behind them, close enough that they could feel its breath, could hear the crack of branches as it tore through obstacles that would have stopped a human. David had fought harder than he'd ever fought, had thrown everything he had left into slowing the creature, into giving Thomas and Sarah every possible second to escape. The effort was destroying what remained of his consciousness, burning away the last fragments of David Chen like paper in a fire. But he didn't care. If he could save them, if he could give them this chance, it would mean something. His damnation would mean something. They'd reached a cliff edge, a 20-foot drop to a frozen river below. Thomas hadn't hesitated. He'd picked Sarah up and jumped, and David had felt the Wendigo's rage as it skidded to a stop at the precipice. The creature wanted to follow, wanted to leap down and finish what it had started, but David had locked its muscles, had held it in place with the very last of his strength. He'd watched Thomas and Sarah scramble across the ice, had watched them reach the far shore and disappear into the trees. They were heading in the right direction now, toward the ranger station, toward safety. They would make it. They had to make it. The Wendigo had turned its fury inward then, had attacked David's consciousness with savage intensity, punishing him for the interference. David had felt himself fragmenting under the assault, felt his memories scattering like leaves in a storm, felt everything that made him David Chen being systematically destroyed. He tried to hold on, tried to remember his own name, his own life, but it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Everything was slipping away, and soon there would be nothing left but the hunger, the cold, the eternal winter of the Wendigo spirit. But in those final moments of coherent thought, David had felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not redemption, but the simple peace of knowing he'd done one good thing with what remained of his humanity. He'd saved them. He'd protected a child, and maybe that didn't balance the scales for Marcus and Ruth and Aaliyah. Maybe it didn't earn him forgiveness or absolution, but it was something. It was enough. The Wendigo had claimed him fully after that, had consumed the last fragments of David Chen and integrated them into its own alien consciousness. The creature that remained was no longer fighting itself, no longer divided. It was purely Wendigo now, purely hunger, purely the spirit of winter and cannibalism and insatiable appetite. It had returned to the deep forest, to the places where humans rarely ventured, and it had begun to hunt in earnest. But somewhere in the vast emptiness where David Chen had once lived, a memory persisted. Blue eyes in a flashlight beam, a father and daughter running through snow, the echo of his own name spoken with recognition rather than fear. Thomas and Sarah had made it to the ranger station after 36 hours of continuous travel, half frozen and barely coherent. They told their story: the separation in the storm, the creature in the woods, the man who had been David Chen. The rangers had been skeptical at first, attributing the tale to hypothermia and fear, but the search teams they'd sent out had found things that changed their minds. They'd found the remains of Ruth Kowalski and Aaliyah Washington, partially buried under snow and bearing injuries that no animal could have inflicted. They'd found tracks that shouldn't exist, impressions in the snow that suggested something massive and bipedal moving through the forest. They'd found trees marked with claw marks too high and too deep to be from any known predator. The official story became a series of unfortunate accidents and a possible encounter with a deformed bear, but the rangers who'd grown up in Minnesota, who'd heard the old stories from their Ojibwe neighbors, they knew better. They'd seen the evidence, had felt the unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of the forest, had noticed how the animals had fled the area entirely. They'd requested additional patrols, had posted warnings about venturing into the Superior National Forest alone, had quietly consulted with tribal elders who'd confirmed what they already suspected. The Wendigo had returned to Minnesota, and it would hunt until it was stopped or until it finally consumed itself in its own hunger. Thomas hadn't been able to leave it alone. In the weeks following their rescue, he'd researched everything he could find about the Wendigo, had interviewed elders who were willing to speak with him, had pieced together a picture of what David Chen had become and what could be done about it. The answers were not encouraging. According to the legends, a Wendigo could only be destroyed by fire or by silver, and even then it took considerable effort and risk. The creature was enormously strong, preternaturally fast, and driven by a hunger that made it nearly impossible to reason with or predict. Most people who encountered a Wendigo didn't survive to tell the tale. Thomas had survived, but the experience had marked him, had planted nightmares in his mind that would likely never fully fade. Sarah had changed too. The bright, confident girl who'd wanted to prove herself capable on a hunting trip had been replaced by someone quieter, more serious, old beyond her 14 years. She'd started having dreams about the creature, about eyes that were too human in a face that was too monstrous, about a voice that whispered her name in the darkness. The therapist her mother had insisted she see attributed it to PTSD, prescribed medication and counseling sessions, but Sarah knew it was more than that. She felt connected to the thing in the forest, linked in some way she couldn't fully explain. Sometimes she thought she could feel it out there, alone in the cold, fighting a battle it had already lost against a hunger it could never satisfy. Winter deepened across Minnesota. The Superior National Forest became a landscape of white and shadow, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Park rangers reported unusual activity. Missing hikers, strange sounds in the night, areas where the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees for no apparent reason. The disappearances weren't frequent enough to cause panic, but they followed a pattern that the rangers recognized. Something was hunting in the forest, something that moved with intelligence and purpose, something that selected its prey with care. David Chen, or what had been David Chen, stalked through that frozen wilderness like a nightmare given form. The Wendigo was fully in control now, had integrated every fragment of David's consciousness into its own, had grown to enormous size from its feedings. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, its antlers branching into elaborate structures that resembled bare oak trees, its skin so translucent that the bones beneath glowed with a faint luminescence in the moonlight. It moved through the snow without leaving footprints, passed through the forest without disturbing branches, hunted with a silence that made its victims doubt their own senses until it was too late. But echoes remained, deep in the architecture of the creature's mind. In places where the Wendigo spirit couldn't fully reach, fragments of David Chen persisted. They weren't conscious exactly, weren't capable of thought or resistance, but they influenced the creature in subtle ways. It avoided children when it hunted. It sometimes left warnings for hikers who ventured too deep into its territory. It chose victims who seemed, in some indefinable way, deserving of judgment: poachers who killed for sport, abusers fleeing into the wilderness, criminals seeking to disappear into the forest's vastness. The Wendigo didn't understand why it made these choices, didn't recognize them as remnants of David's morality, but it followed these strange instincts nonetheless. Thomas became obsessed with tracking the creature, with understanding its patterns and predicting its movements. His wife had left him over it, had taken Sarah and moved to Minneapolis, where they could pretend the forest and its monsters didn't exist. But Thomas couldn't pretend. He'd looked into those eyes, had seen the man trapped inside the monster, had understood that David Chen was still in there somewhere, still suffering, still fighting a battle that he'd already lost. Thomas felt responsible. Irrational as it was, he felt that by surviving, by being saved, he'd condemned David to an existence worse than death. The least he could do was witness it, was acknowledge it, was try to understand it. He'd returned to the forest a dozen times, always alone, always prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't return. He'd started documenting everything, the sightings, the disappearances, the strange phenomena that surrounded the Wendigo's presence. He'd built a network of contacts among the rangers and the tribal communities, had become an informal expert on this particular manifestation of the ancient curse. People started coming to him with their stories, their fears, their questions about what walked in the Minnesota wilderness. Thomas listened to them all, recorded everything, and continued his solitary vigils in the forest. On a night in late December, when the temperature dropped to 30 below zero and the stars seemed close enough to touch, Thomas encountered the Wendigo again. He'd been tracking unusual activity near the boundary waters, following reports of a missing ice fisherman who'd vanished from his shack without a trace. Thomas had found the shack intact, the man's gear undisturbed, but a set of tracks leading into the forest that made his blood run cold. He'd followed them against all common sense, driven by the need to know, to understand, to somehow make sense of what David Chen had become. The Wendigo had been waiting for him. It stood at the center of a clearing, bathed in moonlight that turned its translucent skin silver, its antlers casting shadows that looked like prison bars across the snow. Thomas had stopped at the tree line, had raised his camera with shaking hands, had stared at the creature that had haunted his dreams for months. They'd regarded each other across that frozen space, predator and witness, monster and survivor, and Thomas had understood something that would change everything he thought he knew about the curse. The Wendigo was suffering, not in the way a wounded animal suffers, but in a deeper, more existential way. It stood in the clearing like something crucified, its body rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with preparing to attack. Thomas could see it in the creature's posture, in the way its two human eyes stared at the sky with an expression that could only be called anguished. It wasn't hunting, it was enduring. And the realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. David was still in there, still conscious, still aware of everything the creature did, and the suffering was beyond anything Thomas could comprehend. He'd lowered his camera slowly, had taken a step into the clearing. The Wendigo's head had snapped toward him with predatory speed, but it hadn't moved, hadn't advanced. Thomas had taken another step, then another, until he stood less than 10 feet from the creature that had chased him and his daughter through the snow. Up close, the wrongness of it was overwhelming. The impossible proportions, the backwards joints, the skin stretched so thin he could see the creature's heart beating in its chest like a captured bird. But it was the eyes that destroyed him. David's eyes. Blue eyes full of recognition and plea and desperate, hopeless despair. "I see you," Thomas had whispered, his voice cracking in the cold air. "I see you, David. I know you're still in there. I know you're fighting." The Wendigo had made a sound then, something between a growl and a sob, a noise that spoke of suffering beyond language. Its skeletal hand had reached toward Thomas, slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might break something precious. Thomas had stood his ground, had let those elongated fingers brush against his shoulder with surprising gentleness. He'd felt the cold radiating from the creature's touch, had felt his own body temperature dropping from proximity alone, but he hadn't moved. They'd stayed like that for a long moment, man and monster, connected by the terrible knowledge of what had been lost and could never be recovered. Then the Wendigo had pulled away, had turned and disappeared into the forest with impossible speed, leaving Thomas alone in the clearing, with tears freezing on his cheeks. He'd understood then what he needed to do, what David was asking for, even if he couldn't say the words. The Wendigo couldn't be saved, couldn't be cured, couldn't be returned to human form, but it could be released. It could be freed from the suffering that stretched out endlessly before it. David had saved Thomas's daughter. The least Thomas could do was grant David the only mercy still available to him. Preparing to kill a Wendigo required resources and knowledge that Thomas didn't possess, but he was determined to acquire both. He'd spent the next 3 months consulting with every expert he could find, every person who'd studied the legends or encountered the creatures themselves. He'd learned that silver bullets weren't just folklore, they were necessary, the only thing that could permanently harm a Wendigo's supernatural flesh. He'd learned that fire was equally important, that the body needed to be completely consumed to prevent the spirit from finding a new host. He'd learned that timing mattered, that the creature was most vulnerable during the new moon, when the darkness was complete, and its connection to the winter was temporarily weakened. But most importantly, he'd learned about the heart. Every Wendigo had a heart of ice at the center of its chest, visible through the translucent skin, pulsing with a light that was the physical manifestation of its hunger. Destroying that heart was the only way to truly kill the creature, to sever the connection between the spirit and its host. A silver bullet through the heart, followed by fire to consume the remains, would finally end David's torment and prevent the Wendigo from claiming another victim. Thomas had acquired a hunting rifle and had silver bullets custom-made, had studied the Boundary Waters topography until he knew every trail and clearing, had prepared himself mentally for what he was about to do. Killing David, even killing the monster David had become, felt like the worst kind of betrayal, but letting him suffer indefinitely felt worse. Thomas had tried to explain this to Sarah during one of his supervised visits, had needed her to understand why he was doing this. She'd listened with the serious expression she'd worn since the forest, had been quiet for a long time, and then she'd said something that nearly broke him. "Dad," she'd whispered, "when you do it, tell him thank you. Tell him I remember what he did for us." The hunt had taken place on a moonless night in March, when the snow was beginning to melt, but the cold was still sharp enough to burn. Thomas had positioned himself in the clearing where he'd encountered the Wendigo before, had built a fire and waited. He'd known the creature would come. It always knew when Thomas entered its territory, always seemed drawn to him in a way it wasn't drawn to other humans. The connection between them was inexplicable but undeniable, forged in that moment, when David had fought the hunger long enough to let them escape. The Wendigo had appeared at the edge of the firelight like smoke taking form, had stood watching Thomas with those terrible familiar eyes. Thomas had raised his rifle, had sighted on the glowing heart visible through the creature's chest, had felt his finger tighten on the trigger, but he'd hesitated, had needed to say something first, had needed David to know this wasn't revenge or fear, but mercy. "I'm sorry," he'd said, his voice steady despite the tears. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry you had to save us. I'm sorry this is the only help I can give you now, but Sarah wanted me to tell you thank you. She remembers. We both remember." The Wendigo had closed its eyes, a gesture so human it shattered Thomas's composure, and had remained perfectly still. Thomas had understood. This was consent. This was David asking for release, agreeing to the mercy Thomas offered. Thomas had fired before he could second-guess himself, the silver bullet striking true, piercing the ice heart at the center of the creature's chest. The Wendigo had staggered, had fallen to its knees in the snow, and Thomas had seen something miraculous. The antlers began to recede, the skeletal proportions began to normalize, the translucent skin began to regain color and opacity. For just a moment, as the Wendigo spirit released its hold, David Chen had been visible again. A middle-aged man kneeling in the snow, looking down at the wound in his chest with an expression of profound relief. He'd looked up at Thomas, had tried to speak, had managed only 2 words before the transformation reversed and the Wendigo reasserted itself in a final surge. "Thank you," David had whispered, and then the creature had collapsed, had begun to dissolve into something that was neither flesh nor spirit, but some impossible combination of both. Thomas had doused the body with the accelerant he'd brought, had set it ablaze, had watched as the flames consumed what remained of David Chen and the curse that had claimed him. The fire had burned with unnatural intensity, with colors that shouldn't exist, blues and greens and purples mixing with the orange and red, and Thomas had understood he was watching something ancient being unmade, some fundamental law of the universe being satisfied. When the fire finally died, Nothing remained but ash and charred bone, and even those seemed to be dissolving into the snow, returning to the earth like they'd never existed at all. Thomas had stood vigil until dawn, had made sure nothing remained that could serve as a vessel for the Wendigo spirit. The forest around him seemed to lighten as the sun rose, seemed to breathe easier, as if some oppressive weight had been lifted. Animals that had fled the area began to return. The unnatural cold that had emanated from the deepest parts of the Superior National Forest began to dissipate. Thomas had felt it too, a release, a completion, the sense that something profoundly wrong had been made right. He'd returned to civilization with a story no one would believe, with documentation no one would accept, but also with closure no one could take from him. He'd fulfilled his debt to David Chen, had granted him the only peace possible after such complete damnation. Sarah had hugged him when he'd told her it was over, had cried into his shoulder not from fear but from sadness, from the understanding that someone had sacrificed everything to keep them safe and would never be acknowledged for it beyond their small family's private remembrance. The official investigation into the disappearances in the Superior National Forest had concluded with no satisfactory answers. The remains they'd found, Ruth Kowalski, Aaliyah Washington, Marcus Rivera, and several other missing persons, had been attributed to various natural causes: animal predation, exposure. David Chen had been listed as missing, presumed dead, lost to the same wilderness that had claimed his colleagues. No one mentioned monsters. No one spoke of curses. The world went on as if the supernatural hadn't touched it, as if ancient hungers didn't still lurk in the deep places, waiting for the next person desperate enough or unlucky enough to feed them. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen behind the curtain of ordinary reality, had understood that the world was stranger and darker than most people could imagine. He'd learned that some hungers could never be satisfied, some transformations could never be reversed, some prices were far too high for any reasonable transaction. He'd also learned that humanity could persist in the most unlikely places, that even inside a monster driven by supernatural hunger, fragments of compassion and sacrifice could survive. David had fought for months to resist the Wendigo, had protected strangers when he could have easily fed, had saved a child he didn't know at the cost of his own last comfort. That kind of strength, that kind of stubborn humanity, deserved to be remembered even if the world would never know the full story. Thomas had started a private memorial in his basement, a wall dedicated to David Chen and the others who'd been lost to the Wendigo's hunger. He'd included photos, research notes, maps of where everything had happened. It wasn't official, would never be recognized, but it mattered to him. It mattered that someone knew, that someone acknowledged what David had sacrificed, that someone bore witness to the battle he'd fought and ultimately lost. On the anniversary of the night he'd killed the Wendigo, Thomas would visit that memorial and speak to David's photo, would update him on Sarah's life, on how she'd started college studying environmental science, on how she dedicated herself to protecting the wilderness that had nearly killed them both. He liked to think David would approve, would be glad that something positive had come from their encounter. The Superior National Forest stretched across northeastern Minnesota in endless waves of pine and birch, beautiful and dangerous, and full of secrets that humanity had barely begun to understand. Hikers still disappeared occasionally, though never with the frequency or horror of that terrible winter. The Ojibwe elders still told stories of the Wendigo, still warned against the dangers of consuming human flesh or allowing hunger to consume the soul. And deep in the forest, in places where the sunlight barely reached and the snow never fully melted, some claimed they could still hear whispers on the wind. Not the voice of the Wendigo, but something else, something that sounded almost like gratitude, like a soul finally at rest after suffering beyond comprehension, like David Chen saying thank you one last time to the man who'd given him the mercy he could never give himself. The lessons of the Wendigo lived on in different ways for different people. For the tribal communities, it was a reminder that ancient wisdom existed for a reason, that some lines should never be crossed, regardless of desperation or circumstance. For the rangers and researchers, it was a humbling acknowledgement that nature held mysteries that science couldn't fully explain or control. For Sarah, it was motivation to protect wild places and the balance they represented, to honor the sacrifice of someone who'd become monstrous trying to survive them. And for Thomas, it was the understanding that monsters weren't always born evil, that sometimes they were made by circumstances and choices and hunger, both literal and metaphorical, and that the greatest act of mercy was sometimes to end suffering rather than let it perpetuate endlessly. The story of David Chen would never appear in textbooks or documentaries. His transformation into a Wendigo would never be officially acknowledged. His battle against the curse that claimed him would never be celebrated. But his choice to fight, to resist, to protect innocent people even as he lost everything that made him human, that mattered. That meant something. And as long as Thomas and Sarah remembered, as long as they carried his story and honored his sacrifice, David Chen hadn't died in vain. He'd become a monster, yes, but he'd remained human where it counted most. And in the end, that had made all the difference between a curse that consumed everything and a mercy that brought peace to both the hunter and the hunted.